Good evening. I'm happy to welcome all of you who have made it in person, as well as all of the people who are joining us online. We have a great program this evening, which is very timely. We'll be talking about the Great Boston Fire, which raged from November 9th to November 10th, 150 years ago. Our speaker tonight, Stephanie Schorow, will tell us the story of the massive fire that swept through Boston, leaving the downtown in ruins. This blaze came barely a year after the infamous Chicago fire, and these events helped to radically reshape fire prevention and preparedness across the country. Ms. Schorow is a freelance journalist, author, teacher, and avid gardener. She is the author, co-author, or editor of 8 nonfiction books, including Inside the Combat Zone, the stripped-down story of Boston's most notorious neighborhood, and Drinking Boston, a history of the city and its spirits. I hope that the people visiting us this evening had a chance to see the temporary display that we put out, exploring the Great Boston Fire. This is a sample of material that we have. I'm Gavin Cleespies. I'm the Director of Programs, Exhibitions, and Community Partnerships for the Massachusetts Historical Society. For anyone joining MHS for the first time, the Mass Historical Society is in fact the first historical society in America. We've been collecting history for the past 230 years and making it available to the public. We maintain a research library with a really remarkable collection, which includes close to 14 million manuscript pages. This includes the papers of 3 of the first 6 US presidents, as well as materials from mothers and soldiers and artists and activists. We make all this available to the public for free. So if you're interested in our collection, you're welcome to come back and do some research. We also host a wide variety of programs. We're only able to host programs like these thanks to the support of our members and donors. So if you enjoy these programs, we hope that you'll come back for more, and we also hope you'll consider becoming a member or a supporter of our organization. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Ms. Schorow.
Good evening. Good evening. I want to thank Gavin. I want to thank the Mass Historical Society for inviting me here this evening. I'm very excited to speak to you about the Great Boston Fire, which is something that a lot of people are not aware of. Many people pass through the downtown crossing every day, but are not aware that they're walking on streets that are essentially built on ash. So I'd like to talk to you about this fire and explain how it started, but more importantly, why it spread, and the repercussions from this fire. As it was mentioned, I'm an author of a number of books on Boston history, fire, crime, drinking, pornography, all the good stuff. So I really enjoy doing that kind of work. Now, I've written about the Great Boston Fire before in my book, Boston on Fire, but I remained fascinated by this fire, and I always wanted to get back to it, so I pitched an idea of doing an entire book on the fire. And why was I so fascinated by this fire? Well, I have to be honest, one of the reasons was its sheer scale. This is panoramas of downtown Crossing, an area where I'm sure all of you have been, either to shop at Macy's or go to the movies or go to the theater there. And this is from 1872, and you can see how devastated it was at this time. So this scale really fascinated me. But the Great Boston Fire is more than the story of just a big fire, just a big disaster. There are lessons that we can pull from for today on a number of different public safety issues. Now, putting it in context, the Great Boston Fire was one of a number of fires in the Boston during our history. And so it was the biggest, it was not the worst. I would say the Coconut Grove Fire was the worst in terms of loss of life, but it was part of a continuum of fires that affected this area. So let's talk about Boston in 1872. It was a city of about 250,000 people at the time. It was a port city, very busy, a center for commerce, a center for sale and exports of wholesale goods that would come through the city and be stored there and then exported. The city, of course, jealously guarded its position as a springboard for the American Revolution. And I think we still do. We're kind of possessive about that. The real Tea Party, for example. And it was it was a place that was considered like a guardian of American culture, the Athens of America. And reforms included things like abolition, women's suffrage, and even animal welfare. So that was the city. Now, the downtown area, and by that I mean the area basically around what we today call downtown crossing, or Washington and Summer Street, and the streets around there. This is a map that will show you some of that. But this area was interesting because it had once been a residential area, an area where Benjamin Franklin, I think, grew up, where there were big, huge residential homes. But over the years, and particularly after the Civil War, it became concentrated into a commercial area, an area for small factories, an area for wholesale businesses, for retail, and for office buildings, law offices, all kinds of manner of that kind of business. So it was the business heart of the city. And in the effort, many of the buildings in this area were new. They'd only been built in the last 5 to 7 years. They weren't just any old buildings. They were built as temples to capitalism, with granite facing and a lot of architectural embellishments, and something called a mansard roof that topped it. So the idea was, we aren't just building buildings for utilitarian purposes, we're putting on a showcase for Boston. Now, at this time in 1872, Boston had what was considered one of the best fire departments in the country. And it was an opinion shared not just by Boston, but many people around the country. It was a mixture of professionals in the sense of full-time assistant engineers, they called them engineers at the time, who ran the department, plus many volunteers and people who were on call. But there were firehouses distributed throughout the city, and the firefighters were very devoted, very committed to the craft, and they considered a craft in the business of firefighting, and took their job very, very seriously. Now, even though this was considered a great fire department, there were structural flaws or infrastructure flaws that prevented the city from being safe. And one of the main ones was the water mains in this downtown area. Now, it had been a residential area, and now it was a commercial area. So water mains that may have sufficed for 1 or 2 story homes were inadequate for buildings 5, 6, even 7 stories high, which were considered quite big. The water mains and the connecting things that brought water in the air these water mains were also old, and they were rusted. And so they were getting smaller and smaller from rust. And so they could not provide water, which would be used in fire engines to get water on fires that would break out. There was also a lack of fire stations or fire houses in this area. The land had become very valuable. And so there was a reluctance to devote an area to a fire station. I think we see the same phenomena today. And then those mansard roofs that I mentioned, they were met, for the most part, they were made out of wood, and they were considered very flammable and a fire hazard. And many people commenting on how dangerous they were, but they were so beautiful, and they were such a sign of prestige that a lot of people didn't pay attention to this. And there were some other issues about hydrants and whether they were as up to date as they could be. So it was not that the city didn't know about all these problems. The city knew about them. They knew about them because of this gentleman here, John S. Damerel, who was the chief engineer, and that's what they called him, the chief engineer of the Boston Fire Department. Now, we would call him the chief today, but they called him the engineer at that time. And he was determined to make the city safe. Now, his background was as a builder. He was a carpenter himself. He'd grown up being his whole family had been firefighters. He was a volunteer firefighter. And so he knew not only how buildings burned down, but as a builder, he knew how to make them safer. So when he was elected to be the head of the fire department, he made it his business to try to get those infrastructure problems taken care of. And in his annual reports, which are online, you can actually read them in 1867, 1868, 1869, and again, he kept saying, we have problems here. We need more water. We need to get rid of those mansard roofs. We need more apparatus in the city. We need different fire hydrants. Again and again, he hammered on these issues. And he discovered that the city officials believed he was hired to do a job, not to tell them what to do. And in fact, at one point, when he brought up his concerns about water, he was told point blank, don't try to magnify the wants or needs of your department or of your office so much. In other words, go away. Now, this is a conundrum because Boston, interesting enough, was very proud of their fire force. But it sort of lulled them to a false sense of security. They knew they were very good, but they felt, well, we don't need to spend any more money on it. In fact, there was an editorial just before the fire that sneered at Damrell's effort to put more firehouses downtown. And at the time, firefighters would vie to be the first to get water in a fire. So they'd rush to have the honor of putting water, to plugging into the fire hydrants, getting their engines charged up, and by the forces of the steam power, get water up on the buildings. But to one editorial writer, he said, well, what does it matter who gets there first? It doesn't really matter. It's considered an honor for firefighters. It doesn't have anything to do with public safety. And he was very wrong. Another thing to put into context was at this time in the 19th century, there were major fires throughout many cities in the country. In fact, major fires, urban fires, were a real problem. They were decimating the cities. And that's because cities were growing too fast. They weren't zoning properly. They weren't using proper safety equipment, safety building codes. And so cities around the country were burning down. Now, there's one of those fires that you probably already know about, which was the 1872 Chicago fire. We know about the Chicago fire. I mean, the Chicago soccer team is even called the Chicago Fire, for God's sake. So it's a part of Americana, and it was a terrible fire. It killed nearly 300 people, 250 to 300 people, burned about 2/3 of the city of Chicago, and was truly devastating. And it alarmed firefighters all around the country who said, oh my God, what happened there? Could it happen here? And one of those firefighters was John Damrell, who went to Chicago almost immediately after the fire, not only to bring money that was raised for firefighters in Chicago by Boston firefighters, but to see firsthand what had caused all these problems in the city. And what he found chilled him. He saw what happened in Chicago, and he came back to Boston and gave a report to the city council and said, what happened there could happen here. It was, in fact, I've seen the copy of his remarks, and it was very blunt, saying, we really need to do something about the water mains, the hydrants, firehouses, and get rid of those mansard roofs, and we need a fireboat, because that would draw water from the harbor and get water on some of these fires. Well, he got the fireboat, but it went into effect a month after the big fire. So the attitude of the city council was, that was Chicago. That couldn't happen in the Athens of America. Or could it? Now, one of the delights of doing these kinds of books of history is that you find all these little side stories, all these little interesting things that pop up about the main topic. And one of the main things that is a kind of a side story to this, but it's important to it, but is the pandemic. I'll use the word pandemic, but they called it an epizootic for horses that swept the country in October of 1872, just before the big fire. And this is, I'd always heard about this. I always knew it was related to the Great Boston Fire because it helped to delay response to the fire, but I never knew much about it. So when I was doing my book, I started to look into it, and it was just amazing what I found out. Partly because, I'll be honest, I was doing a lot of my research during our own pandemic and reading about this horse pandemic and what was going on with that. I said, there are some parallels here, whether we like it or not, but there were. So this, basically this pandemic started in Canada and started to spread. And it was very mysterious. They didn't know what it was. They call it a plague, a distemper, an influenza. And at one point, there would be no sick horses, and suddenly there were more sick horses, and suddenly every horse in a city was sick. And other newspapers say, well, it can't happen here. Well, guess what? A few days later, more horses would get sick and more horses would get sick. So you saw it spread across the country. Now, it didn't kill the horses, but it made them too sick to work. Basically, how you get when you have a really bad flu. And so what happened was transportation ground to a halt in every city that was affected by this particular flu. So you would have men drawing wagons, carts, trolleys. I showed you the picture of the trolley here. Trolleys were pulled by men throughout Boston. And it was, when we think of it today, we have to think of a major power outage to really get the effect of having this stopping of things going on. No sound of wagons, no horses around. Mostly the horses recovered, mostly got better, but not in all cases. And in some cases took out the livelihood of a lot of people. This is a picture of the way that the horse flu spread around the country. And one of the things, this is from Sean Cariff, who is a professor in Toronto, who I talked to, and he's actually looked at this epidemic and he's plotted how the influenza spread, and he found it related to railroads. That horses who didn't look sick, they weren't infected, they loaded them up, and a few days later, by God, they were sick, and by that time they'd already infected other horses. And we have seen this ourselves, haven't we? In the pandemic, people would get sick, and all of a sudden, or they wouldn't have any symptoms, and all of a sudden they'd be sick, and they'd already spread the flu. So the horse flu followed the railroads. And here's the thing about it. We, to this day, still don't know what was the cause of it. We know it was a virus, but at that time, they didn't even know what a virus was. In fact, they were saying, oh, maybe it was something in the air or some other things. They didn't have germ theory. So it remained very mysterious, but it brought out a lot of people. We believe this is an illustration by Thomas Nast, the famous cartoonist, who brought us the elephant and the donkey as our political symbols. But again, one of the side notes of this kind of research was of the things I looked into in terms of the animal welfare groups that got really involved trying to protect the horses. This is an example. There were poems written about this thing, talking about how sad it was for the horses, even though they started to recover. But Angel of Angel Memorial, Roger Angel, I think, had a newsletter called Our Dumb Animals, meaning dumb in the sense they can't speak for themselves. And it talked a lot about the horses and the welfare efforts for them. So we still don't know what caused this. Two reasons for that. One, horses developed a kind of immunity to it, or we stopped using horses. So it has never reappeared again. So we still don't know what caused it. Now, there was a problem, obviously, with a lot of transportation, but it posed a particular problem for the fire department. The fire department at this time, the fire service, used steam powered engines, and basically they would burn wood or coal, create pressure, and that would generate the pressure to get water onto buildings. That was a very important part. And these were fairly heavy machinery, and they had to be pulled by horses, and very specially trained horses. A fire horse was very carefully trained to not run when there was fire, not run with sparks, not run with smoke, but stand patiently while the hoses were reeled and put on, and the water was put on fire. And also, when a bell rang in a firehouse, the horses would go to their stalls, the harnesses would drop down on them, and they'd be off to a fire. So the horses got very sick. and they couldn't be used. And you couldn't bring in new horses. They had to be special trained. So Damrell was really worried that this would pose a real problem to the city. So he had a meeting with his chief engineers, who are like his lieutenants, and they came up with a plan in which men would go back to pulling the fire engines, as they used to. Men used to pull fire engines when they're hand pumpers, but what they did was they set up a system where men would pull these engines, and they would have fewer engines respond to each alarm, so they wouldn't spread themselves too thin, so the city would be protected. And that seemed to work for a while until it didn't. Now, I'm often asked about what caused this fire, and I'll talk about that, but that's not the issue. Fires were caused all the time. There were always fires. I mean, the fire department was very busy this time. But this fire got out of control and got so hot and spread so quickly and so devastatingly that it's in a different category. It wasn't just an initial failure, it was a systems failure. And I think that that's something to think about when we look at this disaster and other disasters. Look at them as system problems. Now, the National Fire Protection Association uses what they call a fire and life safety ecosystem to explain how you can protect people. And I've used some of these issues in interpreting this fire. And in fact, I gave a talk on this to the NFPA about how we can use this life systems code to look at the Great Boston Fire. But that's something I want to emphasize here, that it was a systems failure, not one specific failure. But let's go up to the night of November, 150 years ago, November 9th, 1872. Now, fire was first seen in this building at Kingston Summer Street about 7 p.m. And it was kind of in the basement, lower part. And we think that the cause of the fire was never determined, but there's some thought that there was a furnace in the basement, that a spark emerged, it lit up some combustible material, the fire quickly spread, the building was filled with combustible material like clothes, and there's a small factory and a lot of goods there. A lot of the buildings at this time were chock full of material because of the Christmas holiday. So fire was seen in the basement, and it very quickly took over this whole building, but we don't know the exact cause. I mean, a workman had left the building just like an hour, less than an hour, and he said everything was fine. Now, remember, it's 7 p.m., it's dark, because this is a commercial, there are not too many people there, but so that by the time the fire was seen, it had gotten going pretty good, as they say. Now, something about the fire alarm system in Boston. There's fire alarm. I mean, I'm sure there's a fire alarm in this wherever we are here somewhere. And Boston was actually a pioneer in the fire alarm system, which is based on the telegraph. It was not based on electricity the way we think of electricity today, but it was not based on telegraph. So there are fire boxes all over the city, similar to this one. And what you do is you open them, and there's a little picture there. You actually crank it. It sends a signal to the fire headquarters. Fire headquarters says, oh, box 52 is ringing. I'm going to alert fire stations. I'm going to send a signal to the fire station, but I'm going to ring church bells that will signal where this box is. And it would ring five rings, then 2 rings, 5 rings and 2 rings, counting out 52. There was a problem with these boxes. They were kept locked, and that was because they were worried about false alarms. So there was always a responsible citizen nearby who would have a key, and every policeman had a key. So even after somebody saw fire and started yelling about fire and calling for it, it was a delay in finding a policeman to unlock the box, and it was box 52, crank it, and send an alarm to fire headquarters, which would alert fire engines to come to this particular location. First alarm went out 7. You can see the sequence that we actually know. First alarm, second alarm, third alarm, fourth alarm brought everybody in the city to the spot. Damrell himself, John Damrell, lived on Beacon Hill at the time. And he heard that. He heard the box 52. He knew exactly where it was. He knew it was a bad box, a bad area. So he grabbed his helmet and his his equipment and ran from Beacon Hill down to the corner of Summer, Lincoln, and Bedford Streets where the box was pulled. And then he saw the fire, and he saw his men were already there. But by that time, the fire was so huge, it had consumed the entire building, and it was starting to spread. There were initial efforts to control it right there, but the problem was getting enough water on it. Water kept running out because of the problems with the water. And it just got so hot that it was hard to control from the beginning. One of the problems was these buildings, a lot of these buildings were made out of granite. Granite has little pockets of air in it. So granite was literally exploding from the heat of the fire. So you had firefighters trying to dodge granite raining down on them, and they just could not stop this fire from spreading. Here's how it spread. Started, you can see in the lower half of the screen here, and I hope you guys online can see this as well, that it started about 7 to 8 p.m. in this area now on Summer Street, and it just kind of relentlessly spread to the north. Partly there was no real wind problems, but the fire got so hot it created its own kind of wind, and it just kind of became a hurricane that moved. And you can see it moved right to the wharfs, burned right every bit of wharf in the city. If there'd not been an ocean there, it would have burned London because it was so hot. It just kept going. And this is how it started, and it was very difficult to get it under control. The fire started in this area. I don't know if that's the exact spot. I was playing with it just before. It's either on this side of the street or the other side of the street, but it's kind of hard to tell because of the buildings. But it was right in this area, and you can see what happened afterwards. And then what you had was fire spreading and spreading and spreading. And firefighters were just doing their best to keep it from spreading, and they were just being outmanned by this particular fire. There was a word that was used for it, and it was called the fire fiend. And it's interesting to see this word repeated over and over again in the newspapers of the day, that they actually gave this fire a personality, almost a malevolent monstrosity that was determined to destroy Boston. The couple reasons why it spread. One was fire would spread roof to roof, which makes it very difficult to fight, and that's because of those mansard roofs. They're made out of wood. They're essentially elevated lumber yards, as Damrell put it, and so the fire would spread above, and it was very hard to get to them. The other problem was, again, they kept running out of pressure, trying to get water on the tops of these buildings, and you can see from here that was very difficult to do. Now, let me emphasize one thing. There are no actual photographs of the actual fire itself while it was going on. Photography at the time was not that well advanced. It needed light, it needed stability, it needed exposure, but we have plenty of lithographs of this fire from places like Harper's Weekly. In fact, you can see some of them in the exhibit here. There's some really astonishing, it was just wonderful, horribly wonderful, but the way they pictured it. But you could see that there was a problem with the water. You can see firefighters also had a problem with crowd control, the buildings that were filled with combustible material, and the people in the streets. And part of that was people came to see a fire. They still do. They go out to see the fire. But many of the people were merchants who were trying very hard to get their stuff out of they could see the fire coming, and they were trying to get as much as they could out of their buildings to try to save it. And then there was a certain area of the city that had housing. Most of this was commercial, but there were certain areas with housing, and people were trying to gather up everything that they owned and actually brought it to the Boston Common area and camped there for the night. Many of the merchants, when they found that the fire was coming too fast and they couldn't get their stuff away, started giving it away. So it was giving it to people. So the police had a hard time figuring out who was a looter and who was taking advantage of free stuff. So these were the kind of factors that were preventing Damrell from really getting a handle on this fire. Now here's something. Here's a picture of Franklin Street before the fire. You can see how how beautiful and elegant it is. And here is a picture of it during the fire. Here's another dramatic picture of the fire. It's from a lithograph, and you can just see how it just the flames reached the sky on this. It could be seen from miles and miles offshore, and it just looked like it was going to take over the whole city. And there's a beautiful painting, by the way. They have an exhibit of this fire. Now, Damerel did a couple things. He called for help from all over the area. Not only did every firefighter in Boston come to downtown to help fight this, but by telegraph, he asked for people to come from surrounding communities. So communities all around the city came in, plus firefighters came in from as far away as New Hampshire, Maine, and Connecticut. In many cases, they loaded up their fire engines on a train and brought it into the city. But this very dramatic picture, and you'll see an original of it here from Harper's, just shows you what they were up against. And if you can imagine, there was nothing but a hose and some water between them and the fire fiend. No breathing apparatus, very little protective gear, just pure guts. And that's what the firefighters demonstrated. Now, a lot of people jumped in to help, and there were a lot of volunteers who came and did the best that they could. And Damerel was beset by people from the city council. I mean, the city officials were coming in demanding what was going on. They demanded Damerel leave the fire scene and come and talk to them at City Hall. And one of the things that they wanted him to do something. And the do something was to use gunpowder to blow up buildings, to create a fire break. Now, this is something used in firefighting even today. You hear about it when they burn an area so the fire can't jump over it. And they were demanding that he start blowing up buildings. Damerel was very reluctant to do this because he said this was done in Chicago. It didn't seem to work well, but he kind of gave in to pressure because, the city was burning, and he said, well, we might as well try it. So he deputized people to go around the city and blow up buildings. Well, as you imagine, it didn't work. The fire would jump over, they'd blow up a building, would just go over it. And there was another systems problems. The city at this time was lit by gas lights, and the gas mains that fed into these areas could not be turned off block by block. It could only be turned off at the main area. So you blew up a building, gas would continue to pour out, it would pool, and it would ignite. So Damerel finally had to send out word, no more blowing up of buildings, or you'd be arrested. This is another interesting little side note about having an informed public. Patrick Donahoe, who was the publisher of The Pilot, which is still around today, really interesting guy, very interesting person. And but apparently he had asked for a fire hydrant to be removed from outside his brand new building that he had built for The Pilot. And we have this today. We saw this, I think it was John Kerry on Beacon Hill didn't want a hydrant in front of his house, so they had it moved. Well, there's no telling if this had anything to do with it, but the night of the Great Fire, he watched as his brand new building burned to the ground. And that's kind of a sad note for that. Now, the fire brought in, as I said, a lot of witnesses. And one of the joys of the internet is finding things that you wouldn't necessarily find because you can do these massive Google searches. So I managed to find quotes from Louise Malcott, who went out, put on her boots, went out and looked at the fire. And this is her description of it. I saw a reference to it, but I had to go to the library to actually find the letter. She wrote a letter to her sister about it. But she described it as being like the last days of Pompeii. William Lloyd Garrison, the famous abolitionist, was a secret spark. He liked to go out and watch fires. I found these references to that. He liked to go out. Arthur Fiedler was a spark, so he was in good company. Yeah. So he was in good company. But he went out and looked at this fire. And then Alexander Graham Bell, they all had three names at this time. Do you notice that? But he went out, and we have letters from him talking about how he went out and helped and he volunteered and he wrote a whole description of it and he sent it to the Boston Globe, and by God, they never published it. And I've never been able to find it. So that's been lost to history. Now, as I mentioned, many fire companies from around the area came down, and I have some very interesting descriptions of people coming in from Portsmouth, New Hampshire, with their engine, kind of like they put it on a train, brought it down. And one of the companies from New Hampshire was called the Kearsarge. They had different names for the companies. And the Kearsarge is credited for being a very powerful Amoskeag fire engine, and was able to come down and manage to get water on the Old South Meeting House. The Old South Meeting House, many people thought it was doomed. The fire came right up to it. And many people heard the bell rings and said, that's going to be the last time we hear that. But the Kearsarge came in, at least this is a story, there's some dispute, came in and managed to get water on the building, and it was saved. And those were Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and Boston has always had that connection. So it took more than 24 hours, almost 2 days, to get this fire under control. And Damerel, with all these new men, he was able to create lines of defense and keep the fire from spreading. Nothing he could do about it going to the wharfs, but he was able to keep it from spreading. There was, unfortunately, Sunday night, a second fire kind of broke out because the gas was continuing to come, and that ignited, even though they turned the gas off, the whole city was plunged into darkness. It broke out. So technically the fire wasn't out until Monday. The bulk of it was out by Sunday, but not then. And firefighters remained on the scene trying to wet down the scene. And this is a very dramatic photo of one of those machines chugging away. You can see how it's still chugging away, and someone's still spraying water on some of the ruins. And this is what Boston woke up to on Monday: a city devastated. Here's Boston before the fire, and here's the area that was destroyed by the fire. So here's another view of this devastation. And here's the tally. Destroyed more than 776 buildings and more than 60 acres. Tens of thousands of people were left homeless. Millions of dollars of consigned goods as well as buildings were destroyed. About 1,000 firms were burned out. There's many things that were destroyed in this fire, but I want to draw your attention to a couple things. One was the life. 11 firefighters and one former firefighter. There may have been more. This is a little bit unclear, but two from Boston, the rest from around the area died in this fire. And they gave their lives to preserve the city. The damage to this area was well over $1.6 billion in today's money. So per acre, this was one of the most, if not the most expensive fires in American history. Now, the loss of life was not great. That's why I think it's not as well known as Chicago. Chicago fire, almost 250 to 300 people died in that fire. Probably no more than 30 people died in the Great Boston Fire. And you look at those pictures, you wonder, how did that happen? But it could be a fault of record keeping. I did not find any full accounting of the number of people killed. I found several accounts, but they varied and they're conflicting. So we don't really know. So I'm doing an estimate, but we do know it did not have a large loss of life. We do have the names of the firefighters who were killed, including two brothers, very sad, who were associated with the Charlestown Fire Department. Many of these people were killed by falling buildings, and ultimately made the ultimate sacrifice to preserve the city. This was obviously headlines around the country. Another illustration by Thomas Nast, talking about how the country was mourning the destruction in Boston. But you notice something in those headlines, Chicago repeated. And I think that's one of the lessons fire. This was not a disaster that came out of the blue. It was foretold. Damerel had told the city councilors what happened in Chicago could happen here. And unfortunately, he was proved right, because those problems that he pointed out, the water mains, the lack of hydrants, the lack of people, they all played a role. Now, again, in doing a book about this fire, you can find these really interesting side stories. And one of them was about the photographs after the fire. And we have many, many photos of the fire afterwards, the destruction. It became, at least 50 photographers rushed in to get pictures. And there's some amazing ones. And you can see them yourself. Various collections. I refer you to Boston Public Library, the Digital Commonwealth. They have some amazing photos. But when you look at these photos, you're just astonished with, they're almost beautiful in the way they're put together. I mean, these were not just simple destruction. These were very artfully created and very, there was a great deal of skill that was brought into creating all these photos. Now, many of these photos were used for journalistic purposes, and that is, the newspapers or the magazines of the time could not actually print photographs the way we think of them today, but they had illustrators on hand, including illustrators they had sent out to the fire, who could reproduce these photos. And you can see, here's the actual photo of firefighters trying to wet down coal that was burning here. And the other side is what was printed in the Harper's Weekly. And I think there's an original here that you can actually see that. So you can see they were able to really reproduce it very closely. Many of the photographers got panoramas. They were just so amazed by the destruction. They created these panoramas. And I believe, though, this is an illustration that was created from a photograph. But I believe this image, the actual original, was given to William Lloyd Garrison by his son, who wrote about how delighted he was to have this great image. Me, I wouldn't want to put it up, but he just thought it was great. So his estate probably has it somewhere. But that's just one kind of a commercial opportunity for these photographs. At the time, there was something called a stereoscope cards, which were very popular. It was like a parlor game. People would go and they'd have these machines. They'd put in the cards, and they'd get this 3D effect. It was like a 3D image, and this was amazing to people in this Victoria image. And so many of the photos of this fire were turned into stereoscopic images, such as this one, such as these, and such as these. And you can tell there were a lot of them. I bought a lot on eBay, all over the place. When I first looked at these, I thought, well, this is kind of weird. Why do people want to look at these 3D images of destruction? I mean, I could see beautiful travel images and beautiful gardens and sort of images of mountains and valleys, but people like looking at disaster and destruction. Have you been to the movies lately? Everything gets blown up. So this impulse to see this kind of destruction from a safe place was inherent then, and is something in play now. Another thing that's come up, and again, there's a really interesting relic on display here, is relics. People would collect things from the fire and sell them. This box of material, I just happened to have found it at the Bear Cove Fire Museum. I was there giving a talk, and they said, hey, we have this box of material from the fire. And I like, wow, this is very cool. And looked through it, interesting stuff, including 2 letters, which I thought were interesting, that survived the fire. There was after the fire, there was kind of a rush of what we now call disaster tourism. A lot of people came in to view the remains of their city, and why not? It was fascinating, kind of an eerie, horrible sort of way. Many businesses tried to immediately set up on their old locations and start their businesses again, even though they're burned out. But some of them could do nothing more than put up signs of saying, well, we're not here anymore. You can find us somewhere else, and try to direct people to where they'd recreated their business. There was a real push for many of the people, business owners and the merchants, to go in and find their safes, the safes that contain their important papers, money, valuables, gold. And many times they'd open up the safe and find just a molten mess. But oftentimes they'd open it up, and guess what? Things would have been preserved. And another commercial opportunity presented itself. Chandler and Company did a full account of the Great Fire. This came out about 10 days after the fire. It was kind of rushed into print. But on the very back page, there's an ad for Morrison Ireland safes, which apparently, and testimony saying, you're safe, survived the fire, kept all my papers here, and I'm here to tell you that it worked. I have no idea if these are true, but you smell a commercial opportunity, you might as well take advantage of it. So I thought that was an interesting aspect of this fire. Now, Boston rebuilt fairly quickly, interestingly enough. Many of the businesses had insurance, didn't pay everything, but it paid enough for them to get started, to start building again. And I would say in 2 or 3 years, the city rebuilt. And it was kind of astonishing how quickly it happened. Now, that didn't mean the city council didn't want to know what was going on. And so they convened a commission to investigate the cause and management of the Great Fire. And they had about 400 witnesses and just hours and hours and hours of testimony, all of which has been recorded, and you can actually read it online. And guess what conclusion? Who did they really finger for the fire? John Damrell came into a lot of criticism for the fire. I mean, they praised his bravery, but he said he should have controlled it more. He should have been more of a general. He should have deployed his people more. So he got a lot of, you could say, criticism for his fire. His men all defended him, and he defended himself quite admirably, but he suffered a lot of brunt from it. He got sued by a lot of people whose buildings were blown up. So the effect of this fire, and here's the irony of it, the city actually had to suffer a few other fires to really reform its laws. It did start to make changes after the fire. There were a new building code was started to be enforced. They finally got a bit more and better water system in the area. There was an effort to try to straighten the streets and redo the downtown, which didn't happen. I don't know if you've driven there, but it didn't happen. But eventually it sunk in that the city really needed to prevent this kind of conflagration. And after, in about 20 years, the city stopped having conflagrations like this. And they had them in other places like Chelsea, had a couple of them, but they're able to stop it. And part of it was due to Damrell, because right after the fire, Damrell was actually reelected to the fire department as a chief, but the city councilor said, "Oh, we got to reorganize the fire department. We don't like this. We got to change it so it's more professional." And he said, "That's it. I'm out of here." So he quit. And thing is, he could have just spent his time in his building. He had a very profitable building business, but instead he started to work in the area of public safety. He helped to found something called the International Association of Fire Chiefs, which is still in business today. In 1877, he assumed a new position as the chief of the city department of building inspection. He became the city's building inspector. And for the next 25 years, he would investigate all the fires, he'd try to enforce rules about building and building codes. And he did this in Boston. He did it on an international base, on a sort of a nationwide basis. He worked to establish what the NFPA calls the National Model Building Code, which continually gets updated, which makes sure that buildings are built safely. So he is credited. In fact, there's a documentary about the Great Boston Fire called Damrell's Fire, and he is positioned as the person who helped preserve American cities that were burning down, and he helped to try to present codes that would prevent this from happening. His son also worked as a building commissioner. But he eventually moved to Dover in his last years of his life. And he is now buried this is his grave, in the Forest Lawn Cemetery in, Forest Hills Cemetery in Jamaica Plain. And he's much honored today among firefighters. He may not be known among other people, but among firefighters, he's revered. Now, a couple quick stories to sort of end on a cheerful note. That Kearsarge, you know, that engine that was built, it came down to save the Old South. Well, it was actually preserved. It kind of languished in a shed for a while, but finally somebody pulled it out and refurbished it. And in 2010, I'm a member of the Boston Fire Historical Society. We brought it back to Boston on the anniversary of the fire and put it in the position where it might have been when it saved the Old South. And here's a picture of it. And it's been increasingly refurbished, and it's back with it's on display at the Portsmouth Fire Department. Now today, there are very little evidence of the fires. I don't know if there's any plaques. I didn't see, some people tell me there are. I've got to go looking for them. There are not as many as there should be. Box 52 is still marked. There's something called the Box 52 Association, which is members of Sparks and people interested in firefighting. And you can see the box today. It even says 52 on it. It's not technically 52, but you can see it has a special light on it. You can get a Starbucks at the same time if you want. And the Old South church still stands. One other thing that's good to mention, in 2011, the Boston Fire Department got another fireboat, and it's been named the John S. Damrell, and here's a picture of it there. So one thing I want to emphasize, sort of as we come to a conclusion on this, is that in the 19th century, the urban fire, that was the problem. That was the chief menace of fire to the American public. Today, we have wildland fires, which are fires that threaten towns that are near wilderness or wild areas. And as you know, in California, other people, it can be very devastating. So I want to emphasize that the fire fiend has not disappeared. It's just taken another form. People always ask me what I'm going to do next. I've updated my Coconut Grove nightclub fire book, which you may be interested in. And again, there are lessons for that. But the main lesson I'd like to emphasize about the Great Boston Fire is that it's something that's worth knowing today. We should remember it, and partly because it was a disaster foretold. It wasn't something that came out of the blue. Damrell knew the city faced major problems, and he was not listened to, and the city suffered a huge financial blow. Thank goodness not a lot of people were killed, but it was a terrible event that he knew was coming, and he wasn't listened to. So my suggestion for everybody is listen to those people, those naysayers, those Cassandras, those prophets of doom. Don't just say, oh, can't happen here. I won't get infected. Don't let me make me wear a mask. Don't let me do this. We have to listen to those people because sometimes they know what they're talking about. Anyway, I'll conclude on that note. Here are some resources, and I thank you for your attention. I'd love to take a few questions. So thank you very much. So I think we'll try to answer questions someone will feed me questions online and some questions in the audience. Do we have any questions? Here, we have a mic.
Okay. You said that the death toll wasn't that high compared to like the Chicago fire.
Right.
Why do you think that was here?
Part of it was that this was a commercial area. It was more commercial than residential. And in Chicago fire, it was a residential area. So it swept through houses along they had wooden sidewalks, tar, paper roofs. So it swept so quickly, it caught people in their homes. In this area, Saturday night in a commercial area, there weren't a lot of people there. And even though it spread rapidly, it was very fierce, people could see it and evacuate. So there was ample time to try to get out of the way. So that seems to be one of the reasons for that. Another question. Yes. Hi.
During these times, when you own property, you have to have homeowners insurance.
Mm-hmm.
But back then, how prevalent was it to have homeowners insurance?
I don't believe they had something called homeowners insurance. What they did have was businesses were insured. So many businesses were insured by London companies. And it was just very lucky that they continued to be insured, because the insurance companies were getting ready to stop insuring this area because of the conditions. They were aware that there were problems there, and they were like this close to stopping all the insurance, but because they still were insured, the businesses were able to recoup some of their losses. A lot of insurance companies went bankrupt. So the homeowners didn't necessarily have insurance, but businesses had insurance. And a lot of the businesses had enough insurance that they were able to sort of rebuild. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, all those pictures showed lots and lots of people.
Yes.
Is that really what, I mean, I can't imagine there were that many non-operatives in the area.
Well, you have to understand, at that time, fire watching was a great entertainment. And so many people, there are a lot of accounts of people coming out to watch the fire. Was it quite as many as the illustrators depicted? We have really no way of knowing. But Damerl did talk about the problems with cloud control. He said the merchants who started giving away their stuff was one of the worst things that could have happened, because it was so devastating, and people were rushing trying to grab stuff, and it posed a real problem. Many people came out to try to help. There were many volunteers, but there are also reports of people getting drunk and using it as an excuse just to party. I know that sounds weird, but some people reported that. But Louisa May Alcott, she was on Beacon Hill. Imagine, she's on Beacon Hill. She hears about this fire. She puts on her clothes. She goes out and looks at it. Wow, this is very close. And then comes back and then is told, we got to get ready to evacuate. So she records, she put like her manuscripts. She packed a bag with a couple of articles of clothing and a manuscript that she was working on. She had her priorities right, put it in and got ready to flee. But they didn't have to flee. And then she also wrote about, she was helping people. She was giving coffee and cake to people who were running in and out trying to preserve their stuff. And she helped one little boy. One little boy was sent to get his employer's wine, but he found a cat with kittens and he brought those instead. And she thought, that's a better choice. So she did that. She also went out and she saw a dog howling at the remains of a place. And she writes about it. She says, it's so pathetic, I'm going to put it in a story. And I was able to find the story that she wrote about it. There are very few accounts of this fire, very, very little literature, but one of them was Louisa May Alcott's story about an ugly dog. She said it was so ugly and pathetic, I've got to put it in a story. But there were many other witnesses. Some of the brightest lights of Boston went out to look at the fire. The Reverend William Phillips Brooks, who was a reverend of Trinity Church. Trinity Church, the original, burned to the ground. And he writes about watching it burn. And they were already building the new Trinity Church. So he went out to look at it. So there were an amazing amount of eyewitnesses to this. So it does seem odd, but a lot of people did go out. Thank you for the question. Yes.
So there was a firewall at a hotel on Berkeley Street that killed a lot of firefighters, and that was not too long ago. You know, there's statues of them up in Commonwealth Mall, and you mentioned about a firewall falling that did kill some of the firefighters.
Exactly.
That's a bit of irony.
That's a bit of irony, and in fact, that's one of the chief hazards of firefighting is the trouble with falling walls. In fact, we're about to mark the anniversary of what they called Luongo, or East Boston, the Maverick Square fire, in which there was a high loss of firefighters who died just a week before the Coconut Grove fire, but a lot of them died in collapse of building. The fire was essentially out, just like the Vendôme, but then the building collapsed and it caught them, and that was a problem.
So my question was, it sounds like there were a lot of lessons learned for fires, but it sounds like there were probably some about improved warning systems and communications, et cetera. Did you see in your research any application of those lessons to other types of disasters other than just fires?
Interesting. That's a very interesting question. I can't say, I'm trying to think if there's anything like that. The fire telegraph system, the fire alarm system, continued to be refined and improved and is actually still in place today. And I think it's, finally we got a 911 system. So I think that eventually emerged into that. I don't remember seeing any specifics about lessons of this fire to other aspects of public safety. That I'm sure there were, but I can't think of any, but that's a very good question. Very good question. Thank you.
So I just want to say that our program that we hosted last night ended with talking about the fact that Thomas Dowse, who is one of the great book collectors in America, whose library became the Dowse Library, where we had our reception, is now the site of a Starbucks. So it's very fitting that Box 52 is also the site of Starbucks. This seems to be the pervasive theme. But I would like to thank our speaker this evening, and I'd like to thank you all for joining us, and thank you to all the people who joined us online.
Great.
We have books available for sale right outside.
Great. I'm happy to sign them too. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.